There are men who make history, and then there are the people who make the men. History tends to remember the first group. It takes photographs of them, carves their faces into mountains, names highways after them, and fills entire libraries with books about their decisions. The second group, the quiet architects who labored in the shadows, history mostly forgets. But every now and then, the shadow steps into the light, even briefly, and what it reveals is more honest than anything the official record ever captured. Alice Glass was one of those shadows. For 25 years, she was the most important woman in Lyndon Baines Johnson's life. Not the woman the cameras saw, not the woman who stood at the podium with him, not the woman whose name appeared in newspapers. She was the woman he called when he was terrified. She was the woman he called when he needed to think. She was the woman who, by the accounts of those who knew both of them intimately, helped construct the very mind and manner of the 36th President of the United States. And after 2.5 decades of that, after all the letters, all the secrets, all the sacrifice, all the love, the thing she ultimately said about him was not flattering. It was not the tribute of a devoted admirer. It was the verdict of a witness. And witnesses, when they finally speak, tend to say things that shake the foundations of the official story. To understand what Alice Glass eventually concluded about Lyndon Johnson, you first have to understand who Alice Glass actually was, because she was not an ordinary woman. She was not a secretary who got swept up in the orbit of a powerful man. She was not naive, not passive, and certainly not decorative. She was, by almost every account left behind by people who knew her, one of the most formidable women of her generation, and her generation simply did not know what to do with women like her. She was born in 1910 in Marlin, Texas, a small town in Falls County that was known mostly for its mineral springs and its heat. Small-town Texas in the early 20th century was not a place that encouraged women to be ambitious or unconventional, but Alice Glass appeared to have arrived on Earth already immune to that kind of discouragement. She was physically striking, close to 6 feet tall at a time when that height was remarkable even for men, with pale blonde hair and the kind of presence that made people stop their conversations when she entered a room. But her appearance was almost secondary to her mind. She read voraciously, thought carefully, and had opinions that she was entirely prepared to defend, whether the person across the table was a sharecropper or a senator. She left Marlin as a young woman and made her way to Austin, where she found work in the offices of the Texas state government. It was there that she came into the orbit of Charles Marsh, a newspaper magnate of considerable wealth and reach who controlled a chain of papers across the South and had connections winding through the highest levels of American political and business life. Marsh was older, already married, and completely captivated by Alice. He was the kind of man who, when he wanted something, simply acquired it, and what he wanted was Alice Glass at the center of his life. He purchased more than 1,000 acres of land in Rappahannock County, Virginia, and there he built Longley, a Georgian mansion of almost theatrical grandeur, with white columns, sprawling lawns, imported art, and a library stocked with the kind of books that signaled not just wealth but genuine cultivation. Alice became the mistress of Longley in the fullest sense of the word. She ran the household, curated the intellectual atmosphere, and hosted a regular salon of politicians, journalists, artists, and thinkers who made the drive out from Washington to spend weekends in that strange, rarefied world that Alice had made her own. She was, in a very real way, more powerful than most of the powerful men who visited her. She simply exercised that power from a position the era did not officially recognize. In the spring of 1937, Charles Marsh invited a young Texas congressman to Longley for the weekend. The congressman had just won a special election to fill a vacated seat representing the 10th Congressional District of Texas, the Hill Country, and Marsh, who had used his newspapers to support the young man's campaign, wanted to take a look at what he had helped put into office. The congressman's name was Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he arrived at Longley with his wife, Claudia Alta Taylor Johnson, known to everyone as Lady Bird, looking, by most accounts, like a man who had never been anywhere quite like this before. He was 30 years old, angular, restless, with enormous ears and a way of occupying space that suggested he was always about to do something rather than simply existing in a room. He talked fast and grabbed your arm when he made a point. He leaned in close. He was absolutely relentless. Most of the men who came to Longley were polished. They had gone to the right schools, worn the right suits for decades, and learned how to move through elite spaces without disturbing them. Lyndon Johnson disturbed every space he entered. He was not polished. He was, in the vocabulary of the Texas landscape he had grown up in, rough, genuinely rough in the way that a piece of uncut stone is rough. And Alice Glass, who had spent years surrounded by the polished and the finished, looked at this rough, loud, urgent young congressman and saw something that the polished men had long since lost: actual fire. The accounts from people who were at Longley that weekend describe a kind of gravitational pull between Alice and Lyndon that was visible even though both of them were in the company of their respective partners. They found ways to be alone. They walked the grounds together. They talked in corners of the library while Charles Marsh entertained Lady Bird. By the time the weekend ended and the Johnsons drove back to Washington, something had begun that neither of them would be able to stop for a very long time. What drew Alice to Lyndon Johnson in that initial period, according to her own later statements and the recollections of people close to her, was her belief that he was genuinely different from the political men she had known. She felt, and this word, felt, is important, because it suggests something that her reason might have later contested, that his ambitions were aimed outward rather than inward. She saw a man who talked about bringing electricity to farmers who had never had it, about building roads through country that the government had simply ignored, about giving poor people tools to survive rather than just reasons to be grateful. She thought she had found a politician whose ego was in service of something larger than himself. That belief would be the foundation of everything she built with him, and the wound that would finally break her when she discovered it was not entirely true. What followed was one of the longest and most consequential hidden relationships in American political history. For 25 years, through Johnson's rise from congressman to Senate Majority Leader to Vice President to President, Alice Glass was the woman behind the scenes. The relationship was conducted with extraordinary care and considerable ingenuity. Because Longley itself was the natural gathering place for the political world Lyndon inhabited, his visits there were never suspicious. Charles Marsh continued to see himself as a mentor to the rising politician. Lady Bird Johnson, who was almost certainly aware of more than she acknowledged, maintained a dignified and deliberate silence. The four of them, Lyndon, Lady Bird, Alice, and Charles, participated in a social arrangement that allowed the affair to breathe. But the relationship was never purely romantic. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what Alice Glass meant to Lyndon Johnson's career. She was his informal advisor on matters that he trusted to almost no one else. She had an uncanny ability to read the motivations of political actors, to see through the performances that Washington required everyone to maintain, and to tell Lyndon what she actually thought rather than what he wanted to hear. This was, in the political world he inhabited, extraordinarily rare. Almost everyone around Lyndon Johnson told him what he wanted to hear, because telling Lyndon Johnson what he did not want to hear was a risky undertaking. Alice was one of the only people in his life who could push back, disagree, and challenge him, and who he would actually listen to. She also worked on him in more personal ways. When Lyndon first came into her life, he was, to put it in the vocabulary of Washington, unfinished. He was brilliant and driven, but he lacked the ease and refinement that the highest levels of American political power expected. He held his fork wrong. He wore suits that looked like they had been thrown at him from a distance. He could be crude and overwhelming. Alice quietly and systematically worked on all of this. She introduced him to serious literature and classical music. She showed him how to sit at a formal dinner without broadcasting his rural origins in every gesture. She helped him develop the softer registers of his personality, the warmth and humor that he could deploy when he chose not to be the man who grabbed your lapel and barked orders at you. In the most literal sense, she helped make him presentable to the world he was trying to conquer. The letters they exchanged during these years were, by the accounts of people who read portions of them before they were destroyed, remarkable documents. Frank, intimate, politically candid in ways that would have been explosive if they had been made public. Lyndon wrote to her about his fears, his frustrations with colleagues, his plans for legislation, and the calculations behind his political maneuvering. She wrote back with analysis, perspective, and a candor that he got nowhere else. These letters were the connective tissue of an intellectual and emotional partnership that ran parallel to, and in some ways deeper than, anything that was happening in the official record of his career. The problem with helping someone become powerful is that power changes people, and the change is not always in the direction you hoped for when you started. By the time Lyndon Johnson had consolidated his dominance of the United States Senate in the mid-1950s, when he was serving as Senate Majority Leader and had become, by general consensus, the most effective and feared legislative operator in Washington, Alice Glass was beginning to see things in him that troubled her deeply. The man who had come to Longlee in 1937 with a hunger to do things for other people was still there, in occasional glimpses. But he was increasingly surrounded by, and sometimes consumed by, a different hunger entirely. The hunger to be recognized, to be the most important person in any room, to leave a mark on the country so large that it could never be ignored or forgotten. The famous Johnson treatment. His practice of physically dominating the people he was trying to persuade, moving into their personal space, gripping their arms, overwhelming them with the sheer force of his presence and will, was something Alice had helped him refine in its more sophisticated forms. But what she had tried to help him build was a version of that persuasive power that incorporated elegance and intelligence alongside force. What she increasingly observed was the force becoming dominant at the expense of everything else. He was becoming a man whose primary mode of engagement with the world was intimidation, and the intellectual curiosity and genuine empathy she had once seen in him were getting harder to find. The other women were also a complicated dimension of this period. Lyndon Johnson's infidelities were not limited to Alice Glass. He was, by the accounts of multiple biographers and sources close to his White House, a man who pursued women with the same relentless intensity he brought to legislation. Alice was aware of this. How aware, and what she felt about it precisely, is something the burning of the letters made impossible to know with certainty. But people who knew her in this period describe a woman who was increasingly clear-eyed about the bargain she had made, the bargain of loving a man who was, in some fundamental way, incapable of being contained by any single relationship. The 1960 Democratic primary, in which Lyndon Johnson made his move for the presidency only to lose the nomination to the younger, smoother, Harvard-educated John F. Kennedy, and the subsequent decision to accept the vice presidential slot on Kennedy's ticket, marked the beginning of the final deterioration of the relationship between Johnson and Alice Glass. The vice presidency was for Lyndon Johnson a kind of torture. He was a man who had spent years as the most powerful figure in the legislative branch of the American government, a man whose word could make or break careers, whose endorsement could push a bill through or kill it. As vice president, he was ceremonially important and substantively irrelevant. Kennedy's inner circle, the Harvard men, the Eastern establishment figures who had always regarded Johnson as a crude and dangerous force from the provinces, made little effort to hide their condescension. Johnson was miserable, and his misery made him volatile and unpredictable in ways that affected everyone around him. It also changed the texture of his relationship with Alice. The security apparatus that surrounded a vice president made the easy, informal visits to Longlee impossible. The reporters who were now watching his every move would have found Alice Glass in about 15 minutes if they had looked in the right direction. Johnson, whose political survival had always required the management of appearances, pulled back. Alice found herself more isolated from his life than she had ever been. And the conversations they did manage, through letters that were now shorter and more guarded, through occasional meetings arranged with elaborate care, had changed in tone. The warmth and the intellectual partnership were being replaced by a kind of anxious distance that Alice recognized as Lyndon Johnson protecting himself. What Alice saw in this period, and what she spoke about in later years to a small number of trusted friends, was a man who had allowed the pursuit of power to hollow out the qualities that had made her love him. He was becoming a man who cared more about how history would record him than about what history would actually have cause to record. The difference between doing good things and being seen as the person who did good things had seemed negligible to him once. It no longer did. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and Lyndon Baines Johnson became the President of the United States. Alice Glass, watching from Longley, must have felt the peculiar vertigo of seeing the man she had helped build for 25 years finally standing in the place she had always imagined for him. And for a brief period, the Great Society legislation that Johnson pushed through Congress in 1964-1965, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, the sweeping anti-poverty programs, looked like the fulfillment of the vision she had once seen in that raw young congressman from Texas. This was the man she had believed in. This was what she had worked for. And then came Vietnam. Alice Glass's opposition to the Vietnam War was not the fashionable anti-war posture of people looking for a cause. It was something more visceral and more personal than that. She had spent 25 years believing that Lyndon Johnson's deepest motivation was his feeling for ordinary people. The farmers, the laborers, the people at the bottom of the American economy whom the government had always treated as expendable. The escalation of the war in Vietnam, and the way that escalation was consuming the lives of young men drawn disproportionately from exactly those populations, was to her not just a policy mistake. It was a betrayal of everything she had believed Lyndon Johnson to be. She became an active opponent of the war. She hosted anti-war gatherings at Longley. She lent her support to the protesters and the activists who were confronting the Johnson administration in the streets and on campuses across the country. She made her position clear, publicly and privately, and she did not soften it out of loyalty to the man she had loved. This was the breaking point. Not the other women, not the years of secrecy, not the loneliness of being the woman whose name never appeared in the newspapers. Vietnam. The war broke the last thread connecting Alice Glass to the man she had spent a quarter of a century helping to build, because it made her conclude that she had been wrong about him in the most fundamental possible way. He was not the man whose dreams were for other people. He was, in the end, a man whose terror of appearing weak, whose desperate need to be seen as strong, decisive, and historically significant, had driven him to make choices that were killing tens of thousands of young men who had trusted him with their lives. What she said about him in her later years, to the small circle of people she allowed into her confidence, was not the testimony of a wronged woman or a bitter ex-lover. It was something colder and more considered than that. She spoke about him as a man who had possessed genuine greatness and then squandered it, not because of stupidity or malice, but because of a flaw in his character that she had seen early and had hoped, for 25 years, he would overcome. The flaw was this. Lyndon Johnson needed to be the most important person in any situation more than he needed to do the right thing. When those two needs aligned, he could be extraordinary. When they diverged, the need for importance always won.